Yo, 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 what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Actuali Podcast. We're going live on Facebook. We are live on YouTube. We are live on Twitch. And for all those of you in podcast land, every episode is always available on Spotify, Apple, and everywhere else podcasts are found. And so, yeah, welcome. Welcome, everybody, to Actuali Podcast. I'm Chris.
I'm DJ.
It's another episode of Meaning Making 101, covering John Vervaake's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. On this episode, episode 32, we're going to be covering relevance realization in the brain, insight, and consciousness. This is going to be a fun one. Last episode was friggin' amazing. This episode, I believe, is going to be equally so. And DJ's going to help us begin our recap of the last episode, and we'll get on to it.
So we started off with John explaining how relevance realization is embodied and embedded, and what he means by this. So embodied, like a deep dependency between the cognitive agency and the fact that the brain exists within a body. And when he's using the word body, he's meaning an autopoietic bioeconomy constitutive of the cognitive agency. Embedded, let's see how to put this. So biodfittedness is not of the creature, but of the relationship between the creature and the environment. So it's not just in the body, but the embedded within the creature environment relationship, or the agent arena relationship. And adaptivity is a real relationship between, say, the creature and the environment. Or so we have this inside and outside, but not necessarily in a subjective, objective way, even though our grammar leads us to using these words. So relevance is not subjective or objective, but created by the fitted relationship between the body and the environment. It's neither projected, like in the romantic sense, projecting yourself onto, into and onto the world, or empirical, which is to detect the objective, the object, what comes from the object itself. It's the word he used was transjective. It, so it's realized and made real at the same time. So, okay. So what he's doing with, the objective making real and the subjective coming into realness, he's triangulating it with realization.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a triangulation between the three, not like a one or the other.
Yeah, because we're trying to track down the source of relevance in our brains. We've recognized that we can't come up with where relevance is actually happening, but we can actually understand the process of relevance realization.
Well, and we're also very limited by our grammar as well. And like this whole first part is him trying to come up with, at least in this, what we're talking about on this last episode and further episodes, a grammar that we can use using bad grammar, basically.
Whatever we got. Yeah, basically whatever we got. And so, DJ was just pointing out that we shouldn't see relevance as something that we either project, because it's not something that's merely subjective to us, the subject, and it's not something we can detect either merely as something objective. Yeah. We find that it is transjective. Transjective meaning not projected or detected, but realized. And then the realization
transcends both states.
It does transcend both states. Yes, so we have the two aspects of realization. The coming into awareness aspect of it, when you're realizing something, you're waking up to something, becoming aware of something. And then there's also the objective sense, to make real, to realize something into the world.
Yeah, like through effort, basically. The word internal is now one of these definitions we've got to think about a little differently. So not pertaining to not pertaining necessarily to the internal body, but pertaining to the autopoietic system. So it's not yet again, not subjective, even though our grammar leads us to thinking along the lines of subject relationship. So relevance realization is intimately tied with autopoiesis and adaptivity.
And what do you mean by autopoiesis? What do we mean by that?
The self-actualizing maker and a certain sense of, caring about something, reaching a goal, if you will.
Right.
Like, it maybe not intellectually caring like we do, but, like a single-celled amoeba cares about its goal of eating.
It still has wants and needs. So all biophysical
Yes,
organisms
yes,
have wants
yes.
and needs, and they're autopoietic in that sense.
So, we talked about last week the efficiency, or not last week, but the week before last week, the efficiency resiliency trade-off optimization function, and now we're going to go beyond that. Our last episode we went beyond that, which is
that trade-off,
your internal bioeconomy and your external interactional properties. So he mentioned being a machine, like, to interact with the world. Like, what kind of machine do you want to be? Do you want to be a general purpose machine, like a general purpose problem solving machine, or a special purpose? And the idea is not to be either, because your hand's not really efficient at nailing nails into the wall, but a hammer is quite efficient at doing that task and removing them. Right. But you don't want to use the hammer as a screwdriver, because that's not going to work. So you have to expend cost.
That's right.
Energy to carry around.
That's it.
And it's not just physically, but also in your mind. There is a cost to having specialized portions of it.
Yes.
And
processing power that it takes. So general purpose, good example, like DJ was saying, would be your hand. A specialized purpose tool would be, of course, something like a hammer. And
interestingly enough, the hands, even though they're a generalized purpose machine or mechanism, it's an extremely specialized general purpose.
It is, though.
Tool.
Yeah, because you have all these.
Well, it's designed to grasp and manipulate, and it's the best thing for grasping and manipulate and sensing textures and doing a whole bunch of other stuff. But that's going beyond what we're talking about.
But so we're talking about how the world and the organism are co-creating. They co-evolve their fittedness. We're recognizing that relevance realization is integrally tied into our evolution, into our capacity to not just have intelligent interaction with the world around us, but we are embodied and embedded with the world.
And we're constantly creating a more optimized relationship with ourselves and with the world around us. From the start of this whole lecture series, that's been the goal. The main goal is basically fitting yourself into the best relationship with the world.
Yes.
And vice versa, because we are creative creatures that change the world depending on what we need and what we want. And sometimes our whims.
And it's hard to talk about because, like you were saying, most of the grammar that we used to talk about ourselves involves essences that are either subjective or objective, and both of these perspectives needs to be transcended.
Yeah.
So initially the machinery has to be internal, but not in a subjective sense. We just recognize that it begins embodied, embedded in the autopoietic brain-body system.
Yeah.
And then relevance realization. What do I mean by AP? Autopoietic, relevance realization, autopoietic biointelligences, and adaptivity. Their adaptivity need to be connected so that we can understand. Because we're not talking about a middling average, but properly evolving, recalibrating. So we're not looking for some perfect center when we are utilizing these different parts of our brain and being transsubjective. We're actually looking for a constant, proper calibration to our environment. So there's always this trade-off that's going on. You got the pull up of attention or the pull down of attention.
Opponent processing.
Opponent processing
is the term for that. Yeah, and in this last episode, we went over a lot of different opponent processes that are all nested within each other as well.
Yes, they're all incorporated in feedback loops with one another. They're informing one another.
And so Tim Lillycrap, and we looked it up, it's Lillycrap.
It is Lillycrap.
He mentioned to Vervaeke, it's like, well, why not reverse engineer from what we're already doing with AI anyway? Because like we're starting to see similar results. And he got into the term line of best fit, which is I don't know, what would you call it? Not necessarily a graphical function, but something that you can use to help interpolate and extrapolate generalize information through the first one being data compression, which is like, say, if you have a plot and you have a bunch of scattered dots, you find the line that goes closest to, I guess, what would that be, like the mean of all the dots, or no, what's the center? Not the mean, that's the average. The median,
maybe
the center of it. I don't know. However you're compressing, because music compression, it's relatively the same but slightly different. And I don't know what we call it the what's it called? Never mind, geeking out. So data compression, which is to reduce noise and pick up on what bits are a variant outside of this. And then there's the opposite of that, which is particularization.
Yes.
So trying to adhere more, instead of going in a straight line that's just the average through them, going from dot to dot more closely. Now, you don't want to go immediately more closely because, then if you have an error dot up here, it really throws everything off. But, adhere a little bit more closely to it, and then see more ways that the data can be variant.
Yes.
So that's the specialization end, whereas the data compression is the so it's specialization and generalization, which is generalization more efficient, specialization. But if you overgeneralize, you don't pick up on the things you may have necessarily missed if everything's just a straight compressed data line.
Yeah, and the specialized is more resilient. So we're trying to understand, what does it mean to be a general problem solver? And that's why we're going through this right now here. So he brings up Tim Lillycrap, which is like the greatest name ever, because crap does indeed fertilize lilies.
So he's a self-generating, autopoetic, yet self-actualizing transcendent system.
It's there embedded in his name.
Nerd!
Yeah, and Lillycrap did recognize Vervaeke was onto something. He was like, why don't you reverse engineer this? Because we've been trying to introduce these theories in AI, and we're not sure which one's going to come through first, but if you reverse engineer this, we might be able to find our way through this. And so rather than propose a top-down, because these theories are already being developed as strategies, they are looking for something that's going to be more accurate to our transjective experience of reality. So the line of best fit that allows us to extrapolate or interpolate. Yeah, we got that.
So line of best fit, data compression, particularization.
Yeah, we don't want to maximize either. We don't want to overgeneralize as well.
It's the optimization of the trade-off relationship of this particular set of opponent processing.
Wow, listen to that rain.
Yeah, you guys might not be able to hear it, but we got the storm coming through a little bit.
Storm show through, in the background here.
Shoo!
You can see the mountains getting widened out.
So more sets of these nested opponent processes is like your scope, which is your cognitive scope, which is nested within compression, which is nested within efficiency. Which is and then the other end of that is your applicability, which is nested in particularization, which is nested in specialization,
and we're constantly calibrating to fit well to our environment. These are both coupled together. This is actually one process. So they call it what was that term again? Opponent processing. So the processing of this one capacity has these two different sides that oppose one another, but they work together.
Yeah, so it goes
in order to calibrate to focus.
It goes all the way back to your nervous system and your motor sensory functions as well. So this is everything nested within the neck, or nested within the last, So on your cognitive scope, so your compression side, you have your exploration scope, and then you have your exploiting, your timing.
First time, yeah, that's the timing side.
So the exploiting timing has more cost, whereas the exploring, well, you can gather less things from each environment that you're in. Say if you're in exploring an environment.
Yes. Yeah,
but
a chance of adapting, but also a chance of dying when you're in the exploring mode.
So it's yet again, it's important to balance this layer of nesting as well. And he was talking about a way that he quickly talked about a way you could, I guess, like test that or make a little machine to do this. You have a reward error,
the cognitive
reward error reduction or reward error increasing. Decrease. So it's what is it? Temporal. My notes are real bad on this one.
Cognitive tempering.
Cognitive tempering is both of them, but then there's inhibition of return would be reward of essence, and then tempering displacement is reward for. But that's just basically if you wanted to make a little like machine thing, do
a virtual machine.
So he didn't really get too far into that. So
we're always shifting the balance between these to forward the cost of processing power, since we are bioeconomies, bioeconomic machines. You could say machines. That's the closest thing that we have to compare to ourselves.
Machines.
Okay, so
cognitive prioritization of all these functions. So we have cost functions. So the cost of processing, and that's part of our prioritization. Is how much is it going to cost to be able to do this function or take the time to do this?
Yes, or should I be flexible?
Yeah.
And how I gamble now, and how much do I gamble? Because you don't want to min-max too much. You need flexibility. You need diversification, but you also need focus. So you need to keep constantly calibrating.
Yeah, it's going between focusing and diversifying, which is going between scope and time and applicability and projectivity.
This is why he introduced this in an earlier episode. We like to sleep on it. Or take a moment to collect ourselves.
Yeah.
It's like when you break the frame and you shut off the processing for a little bit, then you can come back to it with new eyes.
Yeah.
And you can look at it a little, maybe you'll get the idea that you're missing.
And very much like the relationship between scaling up and scaling down, meditative versus contemplative.
Yes.
You need both in a proper practice, if you will.
Yes.
Because you could think meditative sitting there, under the waterfall, and then contemplative walking along the side of the stream and everything's beautiful, and just thinking about the wonders and the natures of everything and being one.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, because like the internal is recognizing, learning, and understanding how your own mind ticks, and getting familiar with that, and learning to love and accept that. And then there's the outer aspect of what you could call worship. And so this two aspects of mindfulness, the meditative inner and then the outward prayerful or worshipful aspect. And that's where you are embracing the whole world, and you're coming to terms with the world as it is, and the universe and the great mystery and wonder of it all, and with a sense of reverence, perhaps.
Yeah. And so the way Vervaeke broke it down, as you can imagine, like your little L chart between tempering up and down, scope left and right, and then at 45 degrees, your prioritization. At any given point in time, you're at any little spot, and this is called a state space. So you're at any point within this state space.
Yes.
That is a little bit of this, a little bit more of this, not quite much this, or any given amount of ratio between the three.
Right.
So, what's this? Pinochet called the compression end of this. What was it called? Opponent processing is assimilation, and then the particularization is accommodation. So you're simulating a schema, which is a set of constraints, and then accommodating is changing the schema in order to make affordances.
There we go.
I believe.
I think you got that.
And then
so it's like what was that darn word? Particularization.
It's a hard word to say.
I'm trying to go for participation. Particularization versus differentiation.
Yeah, which is the integrating of info versus the differentiation between info too.
Yeah, and so the cognitive schema. that we develop, help us integrate.
Yeah.
So we have the assimilation and then the accommodation. Like awe affords accommodation. Yeah. It's opening our mind up. We're being so blown away by something.
Making things graspable. Or understandable.
Yes.
And affordant. Yeah.
Yes. And our brain has to go into like wide mode to be able to look at something new it has no idea how to get a handle on. So when something awe-inspiring happens, you go into this state of awe. And the brain is forgetting all these particulars so that it can be open to all of this new information that's coming in. So relevance realization is inherently dynamical and developmental. And in fact, there's no distinction between the two. We recognize now.
It develops by functioning and functions by developing.
By developing, that's right. Yeah. And so we're talking about complex systems as in highly differentiated, highly integrated. As systems complexify, they go through qualitative development. We start as a zygote, singular cell, and then initially the cells just reproduce. But then they start to differentiate. And then they start to organize into organs. Yes, into whole organism, which is a combination of many organs.
The best ism we've got is the organism.
Isn't that crazy how on point linguistics are? We develop through this process of biocomplexification, and the complexification is now both emergent and self-transcendent. So we have new emergent abilities to extend into new arenas of self-transcendence. We are inherently a self-transcendent organism. And the relevance realization claim is that this is a unified phenomena that we're looking at. When we talk about relevance realization, we're talking about AGI. We're talking about actual general intelligence. And if we see it happen in machines, then we would call it AGI, artificial general intelligence.
So there was a critique that Vervaeke brought up, which is it isn't, couldn't you say that relevance realization may just be a bunch of different functions, like that are separate different functions that aren't all tied and nested into each other, kind of like what we were talking about with cognitive science, where you'd have the linguists, and then you'd have, the people that look at the machinery of the brain, the people who look at the psychology, people who just look at the chemicals, and we call those the drug pushers. No, I'm just joking. It's psychiatrists.
But you do. You have the chemists, you have the neuroscientists, you have the computer side of it. Everyone's trying to understand consciousness in these different fields. They're talking about the same thing using different terminology.
that would be what this critique is, and what John is saying is, well, no, it's a It's unified phenomenon.
Yeah.
So Spearman observed that kids' success in, say, like math or sports correlates to all the other things that you could, possibly be good at. And I forget what he called it, but it's a certain matrix of like, A goes up, B also goes up, but also so does D and C. And if C goes up, A and B, I didn't get that right.
It was interpredictability matrix, I think.
Yeah, something like that.
So they're interconnected, and they also predict one another's.
Yeah, so when we test for general intelligence, or for intelligence, we're testing for general intelligence, like being a general problem solver, because that's pretty much the best we got to as a marker for success. Like because that's why you're really studying intelligence and seeing how smart somebody is so you can create a creative curve that will help them with success. Like when you're in school, you take the tests that tell you what you're good at, and they should be kind of gearing you into that goal. Or at least when I was in school, I was the first generation of No Child Left Behind, like right in 8th grade or 7th grade. I think 7th grade is when that hit and everything changed. But before that, we had aptitude tests, and I was supposed to go into engineering and music and art. And then, No Child Left Behind. Just children left behind. That's what they should call that whole thing. Yeah. But yeah, so basically we're testing for general intelligence through a lot of various means, which he's got a chart here. We test problem formulation, similarity judgments, like, how similar are things. latent information from the experience, being able to understand the latent information from an experience, adaptation to unpredictable environments, and solving ill-defined problems. And each one of these, goes down into another layer. Solving ill-defined problems is what they call a complex G-loaded workspace. And so is adaptation to unpredictable environments. They share that. And it goes further, but it's basically this constant nesting effect that's happening here as we're diving deeper into how we test for general intelligence as a framework to then reverse engineer it to how do we understand how we realize relevance.
Yeah.
Revelations. Ugh, words, man, not my thing today. That's never my thing. I'm not a wordsmith.
Revelations are typically super relevant to us, though.
It's funny how words work like that, huh?
Isn't it, though? So relevance realization, it's a unified thing. This is what Vervaeke is contending.
Yeah.
And our general intelligence, a developmental evolution of our fittedness. And we're going to continue to dive into understanding more about relevance realization in this episode. And this one is really good so far, what I've listened to. Yeah. And
but he really stresses the point that all of what we just went over, all these ways that we test for information, all these opponent processing relationships, are necessary for
intelligence.
The act of relevance
realization.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Which, hey, at least he's got a large grouping of things. So now you can, if you can, I guess, like hierarchize, that might not be a real word, hierarchize these to which, it's maybe not necessarily which one's more important or which one happens first, but more clearly which moves into which at which period of time according to what's happening. And in this episode, he'll bring up, like look at a 3-dimensional cube and you can, make it look this way, you can make it look this way, or just different visual tests that you can actually see the brain, go from one end, do one thing and then flip to the exact opposite,
Interesting.
Yeah. Cool. So it's, I
think maybe hierarchialize.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, just put it at different levels of which has, more, importance is a bad word, but at that given moment, which is being used the most and which is most important.
Primarily,
primarily.
More so.
Yeah. All right. Yeah,
Indeed.
That's my spiel.
Right on. All right, guys. So we're going to continue to understand the miracle of consciousness. And relevance realization is getting us closer and closer and closer to that. And what Vervaeke is doing here right now is groundbreaking. And maybe we'll hear some more about AI in this episode as well.
What a great metaphor. Groundbreaking, as in like it shatters the stability that you had, and now you have to. Or the other sense of that is groundbreaking, like say when you're breaking ground on a house, the first shovels that are made to then make what you need out of it too at the same time.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a double metaphor.
It's definitely a radical changing of an environment.
Yeah, it could be like
break the ground.
It could be an earthquake, or it can be a settling to make like houses and stuff like that.
Yeah, I like how landmark is another one that I've used that a few times on this. And landmark is funny because it's something that stands out, but it's about a place, and now we also use it as a time metaphor nowadays.
A landmark through the map of time, if you will.
Right.
Yeah.
Or a landmark series. It's like this is a big deal in history. Blah blah blah. But anyways, we are trying to wrestle with the meaning crisis, which is definitely ongoing in our world today. We're trying to understand the sense of meaningless, the growing sense of meaningless in all of our lives, so many people's lives today. We're trying to understand the social breakdown and the ongoing division and how to generate more meaning in our lives. And that is what this whole series is dedicated to, as well as remarrying science and spirituality, which I think is very exciting. And we've gone through some incredible episodes in which Vervaeke is doing that. highly recommend you guys going through this series if you find this intriguing. The episodes on higher consciousness are awesome. The next episode coming up, episode 33, after this one, is going to be wild. It's going to be really good. And there's so much more. I believe there's something for almost everybody here. So if you guys enjoy the show, make sure you do give a like and subscribe to Mr. John Vervaeke, and check out his channel and the videos and playlists, because there's a lot more going on that John's been working on since he released this series. And of course, if you guys enjoy what we're doing here, make sure that you hit that like, smash that subscribe. Helps us reach more people.
Share it with your friends and family.
Absolutely.
Something to have a cup of coffee or a nice brew over, you know.
That's right. Yeah.
Things like this used to be fun, you know, talking about high-minded stuff. And
yeah, well, you know, we're trying to drill down into it and understand our times and our place in our modern age, and how may we best be stewards in this world today. And if that isn't a comforting notion in the midst of rapid breakdown and dissolution, I don't know what is. So here we are, guys. We're going to get a handle together. Thank you for tuning in. This is episode 32 of John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Let's move on over to video. Here we go.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So last time we were taking a look at the centrality of relevance realization, how many central processes, central to our intelligence, possibly also to our, at least the functionality of our consciousness, presuppose, require, are dependent upon relevance realization. So we had gotten to a point where we saw how many things fed into this, and then made the argument that it is probably at some fundamental level a unified phenomena, because it comports well with the phenomena of general intelligence, which is a very robust and reliable finding about human beings. And then I proposed to you that what we need to do is two things. We need to try and give a naturalistic account of this, and then show if we have naturalized this, can we then use it in an elegant manner to explain a lot of the central features of human spirituality. And I already indicated in the last lecture how some of that was already being strongly suggested. We got an account of self-transcendence that comes out of dynamic emergence that is being created by the ongoing complexification. And this has to do with the very nature of relevance realization as this ongoing, evolving fittedness of your sensory motor loop to its environment under the virtual engineering of bioeconomic logistical constraints of efficiency that tend to compress and integrate and assimilate, and resiliency that tend to particularize and differentiate. And when those are happening in such a dynamically coupled and integrated fashion within an ongoing opponent processing, then you get complexification that produces self-transcendence. But of course, much more is needed. Now, I would like to proceed to address, now I can't do this comprehensively, not in a way that would satisfy everybody who's potentially watching this. This is very difficult because there are aspects of this argument that would get incredibly technical. Also, to make the argument comprehensive is beyond what I think I have time to do here today. I'll put notes for things that you can read. I'll point you to if you want to read it more deeply. What I want to do is try to give an exemplary argument, an example of how you could try and bring about a plausible naturalistic account of relevance realization. Now, we've gone a long way towards doing that because we've already got this worked out in terms of information processing processes, but could we see them potentially realized in the brain? And one more time, I want to advertise for the brain. I understand why people want to resist the urge of sort of a simplistic reduction that human beings are nothing but their brain. That's a very bad way of talking. That's like saying a table is nothing but its atoms. That doesn't ultimately make any sense. It's also the structural functional organization of the atoms, the way that structural functional organization interacts with the world, how it unfolds through time. So simplistic reductionism should definitely be questioned. On the other hand, we also have to appreciate how incredibly complex, dynamic, self-creating, plastic, capable of very significant qualitative development the brain actually is. So, propose to you that you can, one aspect of relevance realization, the aspect that has to do with trading between, being able to generalize and specialize, as I've argued, is a system going through compression. Remember, that's something like what you're doing with line of best fit and particularization, when your function is more tightly fitted to the contextually specific data set. And again, this gives you efficiency, this gives you resiliency, this tends to integrate and assimilate, this tends to differentiate and accommodate. Okay, so try to keep that all in mind. Now, what I want to try and do is argue that there is suggestive. It's by no means definitive, and I want it clearly understood that I am not proposing to prove anything here. That's not my endeavor. My endeavor is to show that there is suggestive evidence for something, and all I need is that makes it plausible that there will be a way to empirically explain relevance realization. So, let's talk about what this looks like. So there's increasing evidence that when neurons fire in synchrony together, they're doing something like compression. So if you give, for example, somebody a picture that they can't quite make out, and you're looking at how the brain is firing, the areas of the visual cortex, for example, if it's a visual picture, are firing sort of asynchronously, and then when the person gets it and go, aha, you get large areas that fire in synchrony together. Interestingly, there's even increasing evidence that when human beings are cooperating in joint attention and joint activity, their brains are getting into patterns of synchrony. So that opens up the possibility for a very serious account of distributed cognition. I'll come back to that much later. Now, what we know what's going on in the cortex, right, and this is the point that's I think very important. This is scale invariant. What that means is at many levels of analysis, you will see this process happening. Why is that important? Well, if you remember, relevance realization has to be something that's happening very locally, very globally. It has to be happening pervasively throughout all of your cognitive processing. So the fact that this process I'm describing is also scale invariant in the brain is suggestive that it can be implementing relevance realization. Okay, now what happens is at many levels of analysis, what you have is, right, you have this pattern where neurons are firing in synchrony, and then they become asynchronous, and then they fire in synchrony, and then they become asynchronous, and they're doing this in a rapidly oscillating manner. So this is an instance of what's called self-organizing criticality. It's a particular kind of opponent processing, a particular kind of self-organization. So we're getting more precision in our account of the self-organizing nature, potentially, of relevance realization. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this first, and then we'll come back to its particular instantiation in the brain. So self-organizing criticality, this goes originally back to the work of Vervaeke. So let's say you have grains of sand falling, like in an hourglass, and initially it's random, well, random from our point of view, of where, right, within a zone, individual grains will end up somewhere in that zone. We don't know where because they'll bounce and all that. But over time, what happens, because there's a virtual engine there, friction and gravity, but also the bounce, right? So the bouncing introduces variation, the friction and the gravity put constraint. And what happens is the sand grains self-organize. There's no little elf that runs in and shapes the sand into a mold. It self-organizes into a mound like that. And it keeps doing this and keeps doing this. Now at some point, right, it enters a critical phase. Criticality means the system is close to, right, is potentially breaking down. See, when it's self-organized like this, it demonstrates a high degree of order. Order means that as this mound takes shape, the position of any one grain of sand gives me a lot of information about where the other grains are likely to be because they're so tightly organized. It's highly ordered. But then what happens is that order breaks down, right? And you get an avalanche. It avalanches down. And, the system, and if this is too great, if the criticality becomes too great, the system will collapse. And so there are people that argue that civilizations collapse due to what's called general systems failure, which is that these entropic forces, right, are actually overwhelming the structure of the system, and the system just collapses. So collapse is a possibility with criticality. However, what can happen is the following. The sand spreads out due to the avalanche, and then that introduces variation, important changes in the structural functional organization of the sand mound. Because now what happens is, right, there's a bigger base, and what that means is now a new mound forms, and it can go much higher than the previous mound. It has an emergent capacity that didn't exist in the previous system. And then it cycles like this. It cycles like this. Now, at any point, again, there's no telos to this. At any point, it can the criticality can overwhelm the system and it can collapse. At any point, the criticality within you can overwhelm the system and you can die, right? But what you see, right, is you see the brain cycling in this manner, self-organizing criticality. The neurons structure together, that's like the mound forming, and then they go asynchronous. This is sometimes even called the neural avalanche, right? And then they reconfigure into a new synchrony, and then they go asynchronous. So do you see what's happening here? What's happening here is the brain is oscillating like this, and what it's doing with self-organizing criticality is it's doing data compression, and then it does a neural avalanche, which opens up, introduces variation into the system, which allows a new structure to reconfigure that is momentarily fitted to the situation. It breaks up, right? Now, do you see what it's doing? It's constantly, moment by moment, this is happening in milliseconds, it's evolving its fittedness, it's complexifying its structural functional organization. It is doing, right, compression and particularization, which means it's constantly, moment by moment, evolving its sensory motor fittedness to the environment. It's doing relevance realization, I would argue. Now, what does that mean? Well, one thing we should be careful of, when I'm doing this, again, I'm using words and gestures and of course to convey and make sense, but right, what you have to understand is this is happening at myriad of levels, right? There's this self-organizing criticality doing this fittedness at this level, and it's interacting with another one doing it at this level, all the way up to the whole brain, all the way down to individual sets of neurons. So this is a highly recursive, highly complex, very dynamic, evolving fittedness. And I would argue that that is thereby implementing relevance realization. There is some evidence to support this. So Thatcher et al. Did some important work in 2008, 2009 pointing towards this. So here's the argument I'm making, right? I'm making the argument that RR can be implemented. It's not completely identical to, because you remember there's also exploration and exploitation, but it can be implemented by this. And I've also last time made the argument that relevance realization is your general intelligence. If this is correct, then we should see measurable relationships between these two. Right? Of course, we've known how to measure this psychometrically for a very long time, and now we're getting ways of measuring this in the brain. And what Thatcher found was exactly that. They found, Thatcher et al. Found that there's a strong relationship between measures of self-organization and how intelligent you are. Specifically, what they found was the more flexibility there is in this, the more intelligent you are. The more it demonstrates a kind of dynamic evolvability, the more intelligent you are. Is this a conclusive thing? No. There's lots of controversy around this. I don't want to misrepresent this. However, I would point out that there was a very good article by Hess and Gross in 2014 doing a comprehensive review of the application of self-organizing criticality as a fundamental property of neural systems. And they, I think, made a very good case that it's highly plausible that self-organizing criticality is functional in the brain in a fundamental way, and that lines up, it's convergent with this. So what we've got is the possibility, and this carries with it some. So I'm hesitant here because I don't want to, by drawing out the implications, I don't want to thereby say that this has been proven. I'm not saying that. But so remember the if. But if this is right, this has important implications. It says that we may be able to move from psychometric measures of intelligence to direct measures in the brain, much more in that sense objective measures. Secondly, if this is on the right track, it will feed. Remember, a lot of these ideas were derived from sort of emerging features of artificial intelligence. If this is right, it may help and feed back into this and help develop artificial intelligence. So there's a lot of potential here. Unfortunately, for both good or ill, I'm hoping, if you'll allow me a brief aside, I'm hoping by this project that I'm engaged in to link as much as I can, and the people that I work with can, and my lab and my colleagues, link this emergent scientific understanding very tightly to the spiritual project of addressing the meaning crisis, rather than letting it just run rampant willy-nilly. All right, so if you'll allow me, that's a way in which we could give a naturalistic account of RR in terms of how neurons are firing. These are firing patterns.
Break time. Before we get into the physical nature, as you were saying, we're going to go ahead and break and cover what we just viewed and listened to.
Yes.
Thankfully, this is not quite as dense as the last episode. The last episode was a lot.
Yeah, so
a lot, and I barely kept up with it. And if you guys have trouble keeping up with any of this, don't feel bad. Feel free to rewatch as we have.
Yeah.
Search definitions out. Sorry, I keep cutting you off.
So what Vervaeke wants to do with this is create an example of a plausible naturalistic account of
relevance realization. Yes.
And also give the brain its due. The mind isn't just the brain, and we aren't just the brain, but you got to give the brain its due for how magical of a thing it is.
Yeah, how complex, how plastic, how able to reform itself and constantly evolve its fitting to its environment.
Well, there's been times where, like people have extreme brain trauma and sometimes lose a significant portion of their brain. So it's just most of their brain is water, and then whatever is left still allows the human to function.
It's insane.
Somehow.
Yeah, the whole language area is destroyed in the brain, yet the other side of the brain now takes over and figures out a way to do it.
And how the brain goes wrong is interesting too, because you have some of the more cool ends of how your brain could go wrong with synesthesia, where you can smell colors, man.
Right.
It's a little bit more than that, but basically, or the total wrong end where you have schizophrenia and a total shift off of the angle of reality that everything else is on.
Really?
Yeah. So the brain, give it its due.
So we're avoiding simplistic reductionism. We are looking for a way to, well, the goal, let's say, is to show that there is a way to at least empirically describe relevance realization. And Vervaeke feels that this is a very plausible theory, but he doesn't want to say that it's absolutely real yet. It's still being confirmed and verified in science. But this is the cutting edge of understanding how consciousness and awareness is happening in our brains. And this is also him recognizing the importance of finding not just a salve, but almost like a vaccination against
Inoculation.
an inoculation against all of the bullshit that is out there, all of the nefarious propaganda and the psychological manipulation that is ongoing.
Well, and the natural holes and ankle breakers on the path through human evolution as well, because, it's like something can be very dangerous and not be malicious or nefarious because there is no someone behind it.
Right.
We're just stumbling into it.
It's just a thorn bush or whatever it is.
Like certain aspects of AI where we're just like, oh, well, we just
say,
fell in that hole.
that is the next point, is that he's also helping us understand how we may wisely configure artificial intelligence, because there are a lot of pitfalls, a lot of potholes along the way through this process that could be species ending, or at least destructive in a way that we certainly would not want to see.
So, relevance realization in the brain seems to be shifting, oscillating between synchronization and asynchronization. And
compression and particularization.
Yeah, so synchronization would be the compression end.
Yes.
To sync everything up, and the asynchronization would be the breaking things apart and understanding the particles
pieces.
of everything.
The particularization.
These parts of things. So this is a self-organizing criticality. So we're introduced to self-organizing criticality, which is more, what's the word? More precision. And he gave the example of, like, the hourglass and the falling of the grains of sand, and it's there's random variations, and it should be random, but all these little variations from the gravity constant, air pressure, friction, and then eventually how much
the weight of individual and shapes of individual grains, and how they bounce off of each other.
But at some point though, there comes this critical phase where the order of, say, this pyramid that is being built from
a high
the
degree
sand
of organization
breaks down, and then it completely breaks down and opens up. But then it does the cycle yet again, now with this new introduction of variation and emergent capacity. So when it breaks down, there's this emerging capacity to have a wider base, gather more sand, until eventually it gets to its critical point.
That's right.
And then it goes.
So picture an hourglass, sand is falling, and it's just kind of landing awkwardly, and then it starts to develop a little mound. So now it's self-organizing into a reliable structure that's strong, kind of, enough. Everything's pressed against each other. But then you have the avalanche happen.
The straw that breaks the camel's back, if you will. But out of that and then it self-organizes again, and even more so with a larger comes
base.
Out with more organizing, and it's this
higher degree of order even.
It's this oscillating in the brain, and it's doing
between
this
order and criticality, order and breakdown, and
breakdown. Which
this is what the left and the right partisan sides of the political spectrum
I
do for one another.
I was actually thinking about that earlier today when I was listening to this episode.
Super creative entrepreneurial side, which is typically people that lean left, and then very organizing, conscientious.
Or it's the activist versus or I won't say activist, but I don't want to use revolutionary, but like I'll say the activist versus the traditionalist. The tradition builds up and builds up and builds up to a point, and then the activist nature comes down and breaks it back out, and hopefully it creates a better base to then have more. And so like even in our social our intersocial systems that we have fractals of these, concepts within the brain, and then, well, even further back, just in the body, or the body versus the brain, or even further back, you can talk like chemicals that,
right,
these relationships.
And then further out, how the ways that we organize our societies with different belief systems.
So it's like that first hermetic principle, or no, that the first is mentalism. It's one of the hermetic principles is the as above, so below principle, that also like the Bible has, which the idea, like the best way for me to break that idea down is like at the most minuscule looks like the biggest. And a flawed way you can understand that is like, well, the solar system is like the atom because there's this thing in the middle and these things orbiting it. Now that breaks down pretty quick because, electron orbitals really aren't orbitals. They're
probability
more
matrix.
Probabilities are more lobular depending on what they are, and just the probability that any given point in time.
It's a good visual metaphor.
Yes. But still, if you go far enough into the quantum foam state and then zoom out into the hugeness of the universe, it starts to look the same again.
You still see nucleus and then things that interact randomly on the outside.
Yeah, so that's a multiscalar
bound to the nucleus.
Theory, right?
Yes.
So this is what
multiscalar
scale irrelevant is this process because it happens at all scales.
Yes, every way. So including left and right on the spectrum. And Jonathan Haidt breaks down how we find that people that are typically predisposed to be artists and entrepreneurs typically lean a little bit more left on the spectrum. They might not be liberal, they might be libertarian, but somewhere in that range. And then people that are more organized and conscientious are going to be more often presidents and managers and things like that in companies. The conservatives are more interested in maintaining what is tried and true tradition, and there is actually something valuable there. What's tried and true has proven itself to be tried and true over a long period of time, and we know it's reliable. But you do need new ideas as things change in the world around you, because we are in a chaotic environment.
Much like this, you can't just have one or the other.
So imagine you need the interaction of chaos and order together.
Imagine if your mind's just going into asynchrony all the time. You don't even get to build up that little pyramid of sand.
Right.
It's
and
just
this bird, the
being
U.S.
blown out.
Yeah, and this bird, the U.S. needs 2 wings to fly.
Yeah, right.
And so, anyways, that's a little aside, but that got me thinking on that, man, because we see the entropic forces that lead to collapse, and he was talking about our societies, and that's of course the whole series is awakening from the meaning crisis that we're noticing happening in our societies. So that does fold back there nicely.
Yes.
So criticality. So you get the variation, and then you get a bigger base. You get the new mound that forms, a new emergent capacity, because now there's a stronger, larger foundation, and this process cycles until it breaks down again. The brain, and we're looking at that the brain likely does this. We notice that this works in AI, and we haven't even seen this happen yet, but we know this probably is happening in the brain. The brain is organizing itself, or it's cycling through these self-organizing and then critical synchronization
from synchronicity to neural avalanche to synchronicity
synchronization, and then it reconfigures. So the brain's also doing data compression. Most likely it complexifies, and then it refits itself to the environment, and it's probably doing this, and we notice the neurons are firing thousands of times a second. So very well that's what's happening there. So the constant moment to moment, the brain is doing relevance realization to refit to the environment. That is what Vervaeke is proposing.
Yeah, it's essentially,
and it does this on many levels, like you were saying. On scalar. How did we say that again? What was
scale that? Irrelevant, or scale invariant.
Scale invariant.
Which basically means it works on every single scale.
Yes.
So it is multiscalar. And this whole process is basically evolving. We're talking about the brain here, evolving the brain's fittedness according to the environment and what it needs.
It's recursive, so it's reinforming itself. It's increasingly complexifying, so it can become more sophisticated, take on more and new and greater tasks, dynamically, and it's dynamically refitting itself to the environment. That's so cool. And the only thing that we know that explains how relevance realization could work is consciousness in our brain. So we're getting to the root of consciousness here, or at least to one of its arms, and we're tracing into it to understand, because only living organisms, autopoietic things, can recognize relevance. can realize what is relevant to them.
Or
Have wants and
or
needs.
it's the only place that we can measure it happening.
Right, yeah.
You know, that's the whole thing is, you know, is the tree alive? Is the mountain?
Or is
Does
it
the
just
mountain
too
have
slow for us
memory?
to
Or
see?
yeah, you know.
Yeah.
So Vervaeke brought up, I'm gonna butcher his name, but it's Sanatortil or whatever. So this,
I missed those names.
yeah, I did get his name. You're gonna have to go back. I'm sorry, but I'm catching up as much as I can. But basically, Vervaeke is not equating relevance realization to self-organizing criticality, because they're not exactly equal, but there is a relevancy between the two.
It's highly plausible it is happening in our brain, not exactly the same way that we see it happening perhaps in computers, but in a similar way. Yeah.
But then there's also just general intelligence, your general intelligence, which seems to be tied into like, well, how well does your brain do this self-organizing criticality, and how well do you realize relevancy? They seem to all be tied, and there's a very strong relationship. Now, mind you,
Yes.
it may not be exactly the right theory and idea, but if it is right, there's a lot of applications and understandings to be garnered out of it, even like spiritual understandings as well. So this is the key point in, like, one of the key points in meaning making, not
Very
you
much
know,
so,
not just like how does the brain, you know, like understand the things in the room and all that stuff in the person. No, but making meaning and wisdom and
This is
that, you know,
one of the links to how we may begin remarrying science and spirituality.
Yeah.
We are understanding what is happening in the human brain when someone has a religious experience, why that is helpful,
yeah,
why
being
that
able to
grants
study
higher wisdom and
cross-platform,
understanding,
if you will,
and relational fittedness with the world. So, yeah, and Vervaeke points out we should see a relation between the self-organizing criticality and being generally intelligent and general intelligence. Let's say we know that self-organizing criticality allows for relevance realization, or seems to. Relevance realization certainly accounts for higher intelligence. So we should see a relation between general intelligence and the self-organizing criticality.
Well, I think we're even already
Even if you
kind
leave
of
relevance
we're
out.
even kind of seeing it as well already. Like, you know, like by measuring people's brains while they're doing cognitive like, you know, like when you're doing.
It's working for the language models right now. Chat GPT-4 is definitely recognizing what is relevant in the sentences that I type to it, and it's understanding what I'm asking. And it's, you know, highly complex, multi-layered questions with many run-on lines of sentences within one paragraph, and it's still getting it, man. So yeah, it's very highly plausible that this is what's happening in our brain as well, because we're starting to accidentally figure out how to do it in AI. So the hope is to link the emergent scientific understanding with the spiritual quest of solving the meaning crisis.
Mm-hmm. And that's all I got for that section. I'm at 1644. If you 1644,
Sweet, awesome.
It was like 10 seconds before or so before we stopped.
This is so exciting to me. This is it's very exciting being alive in a time where, for the first time in 2,000 plus years, we're going to see the remarrying of science and spirituality, and it's well on its way. Considering some
I
of
would
the
say
podcasts
within
I've
the
heard
last
recently.
like 500 to 600 years, because I would have to say like Martin Luther did a pretty good job at like, you know, no, this is science and this is spirituality.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Close down the monasteries. Get them out of here. Sorry.
You know, it's funny how our good intentions can have such unintended consequences, and even people that did good things in some ways also end up doing things that were sometimes disastrous for us as a species. So as many minds as we can get working together at once is the ideal.
Well, there's
and he talked about this too. What did he say at one point where he was referring to how we notice synchrony when multiple people are engaging in the same task together?
Oh yeah,
or in
like
a deeply involved conversation
brains
or play
across
together.
different bodies will
Synchronize.
synchronize with each other.
Yes, we notice that does happen. People's brainwaves sync up together.
Well, that makes sense, even just on the base like survival instinct too.
Yeah.
You know, like you like the herd mentality. Everything's running this way. Okay, everybody's doing this. You get into the rhythm. Like even like you could say like flocks of birds and fish, it's more apparent like where
But
they
you can
all
see it in
school
couples.
together and
You can see it in people making music together.
When people walk together, like even chimps do this, like when you're walking with a person versus just walking next to somebody and passing, you'll actually sync up the sway of your arms and your I actually was observing this the other day.
So this might give us some scientific basis for distributive cognition, as he calls it, distributed cognition, which is when many people's minds come together and they start actually thinking together as though you just hooked multiple computers up together. Yeah. And now you have a higher processing.
Because I guess essentially is you don't need to have the hard or the wetware, if you will, hooked up to each other through like chips and stuff like that. But the preconditions to behave in certain ways depending on certain stimulation, when experienced over a vast amount of people, the vast amount of people's brain like are going to kind of go through the same thing. Like when it gets dark, everybody just turns on their lights. That's because true. That condition changes, and what you want is you want more light. Yeah. Now you start to do it into, like you get into say like the internet world where you have so many people all gathering a bunch of information with the wetware that wants to do certain things under certain stimulation, and then you get a whole crap load of people that are all doing it. Yeah, their brains are going to sync up, and it's not because they're hooked together other than the environment, because the environment is a component of this,
That's right. So we're always in a co-creative relationship with the environment. So all you have to do is find a good fittedness to something that's similar to the other people that you are working with, you could say, and you'll sync up. Yeah. And it happens without us even thinking about it.
And I think that's probably like where this emergent, as far as like before we had like culture and society, like where this emergent thing that is culture and society came from, is many people starting to interact with each other, more people's brains syncing up other than you, your friends and your family and your tribe.
That's how we developed language in the first place. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. Very interesting. Very cool. Because we take all of this for granted. We're so used to living in these meat bodies.
Meat sticks.
Yeah, meat puppets and this and that. But we're so used to living in these bodies and we call it, terms like flesh, bone, and all this kind of stuff. But these are just words we came up with for weird stuff that somehow exists now in this universe. We are the living aspects of this universe that have become self-aware, self-reflective. That's such a strange and exciting phenomenon. And it's like we're at the year 2023 now. We're at a certain point of the species waking up now that is particularly exciting. And I do feel us at something of a fork in the road, or maybe perhaps even the better metaphor is phase shift, as Daniel Schmachtenberger calls it, where we're like in a cocoon between caterpillar and butterfly. We have just devoured up almost everything in our environment like the caterpillar does. And if you just look at the caterpillar alone, you would think this thing is destroying its environment. This thing is a total pest. But then after it goes into the cocoon and its whole body literally breaks down into liquid and then it reconfigures itself, it comes out reborn, a new thing, and a much greater version of what it was before. And now it is the ultimate pollinator, and it is the ultimate steward of its environment. Now it had to almost exhaust all the resources around it. It was eating a lot of leaves to be able to grow those wings. But once it grew those wings, now the forest is healthier than it ever was before. So perhaps the human species is going through something like that. We're in our chrysalis. We're in the phase shift. If we come out too soon, of course, the baby dies if it leaves the egg shell or the womb too soon. If you come out too late, of course, that can be detrimental or deadly as well. So the phase shift is that opportune time.
I like to think as a species, we're just like moving through we're past our angsty teenager stage, but we're moving into I know better and I've got all these great ideas, even though I'm
young adult phase.
I have people telling me like, hey, don't do that because it leads, you're going to really mess things up. It's like, nah, I know better and doing it again. Yeah. I'm referring to socialism.
This is like a later stage of our teenage or adolescence or young adult.
Well, and what we're
still working through our independence.
Yeah, we're not listening, and we're at the point where it's just like, no, we can do it better. We can do it, which is important for the development of, the human psyche. New things. Is because first you have to, come up with new ideas and new things.
And be able to survive on your own. Yeah.
You have to be able to, when you do wrong things understand what was wrong about it and how to fix it. So you you have to have that. And I think as a species, we're about there. Yeah. We're still trying a lot of the same things that killed millions upon millions upon millions of people
last century.
Yeah, and we have the old folks just like, whatever, old man, here, here's a beer, shut up. And it's like, so, but the thing is with the young adulthood, with proper tempering and development of maturity,
freedom to explore at a young age. It's funny because you need the freedom to explore, then the tempering as well. Hold on.
But with those proper things, you can shorten the time that you go through young adulthood.
Sure.
Because you can meet that, person who's like 23 years old and, sounds like a 30-year-old who has a PhD in something.
Right.
And you see it on the internet too now, like, a lot of young, brilliant people that are doing some pretty cool stuff. Or young.
And all I'm saying is you need the tempering and the freedom of exploration. Yeah. And we've been actually helicoptering around kids and watching their every second now and not letting them play and figure out things by themselves a little bit more.
Oh, no, play's not essential, man.
Yeah.
Get rid of recess. You don't need that.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because that's not helping kids grow up faster. It's making them grow up slower and stay kids longer.
Well, it stunts them. You like have the phenomenon of, and I'm not like throwing all people who are appreciators of like video games and movie lore and all that stuff, because I am myself, but like there are people that go too far in it, that like, and what it's from is, they do all the adult things, they pay their bills, they got a place, but the mental capacity for advancing kind of got stunted. And it's when you don't allow kids to just actually be kids, so you're in this perpetual not allowed
just
to be
looking
a kid
for
or an
escapism,
adult.
Because it might not be video games, it could be food, it could be
it
junk
could be
food,
anything,
television.
It could even be the Peter Pan syndrome, where I just travel the world and bed another woman every other night, like particularly for males, but like it could be a lot of things. Whereas, and I think that probably comes from our loss of initiation rituals into adulthood.
100%.
That we've had, so. Every culture has had some sort of initiation ritual for the youngsters into young adult. Now we expect things of you. Usually that's around, like 13 years old, 13 to 18 in modern times, if you will. Like if you look at like, the Mennonites, they'll come out and you'll see like, the new kid, he's this 13-year-old kid. Now he's working with the elder, the older people in the community. And it comes out on the job site, and he's the gopher. He's getting the things that everybody needs, or like slinging those shingles up on his shoulder and climbing the ladder. And then as they get older, they start doing different tasks, different responsibilities. And that a work site is a really good example of initiation rituals. Like first you start as the gopher. And the joke's on you to make sure that you can be humble. It's
built into by necessity in building projects, and it always was built in by necessity into our cultural lives as well. But we really have erased a lot of those.
Yeah, and the Mennonites are a really good example of this too, because it's they're, I'll call it Amish light, so they interact a lot more with just normal society than the Amish do, so you can actually observe them a little bit better than having to go to Amish country. And I live in a place, like we got various Mennonite shops. Like one of the best butchers in the area you're going to find is a Mennonite butcher out here. I don't really like their pies. I'm not down with them. I don't think they make the best pies, but maybe that's just the places I've
been. But we do have that, and that's something important, by the way, guys. If you don't have access to good, healthy food from local farmers around you, find some. There's a lot of good co-ops you can join too, where they'll deliver food right to your door. But
and actually, there's some halfway decent food services, like mail services now too, since there's so big of a market for it and there's so many competitors. Yeah, the prices are actually getting cheaper and cheaper, and more deals. Promo code this, that, or the other, and it's just like
we need these things. We need to eat well. We need to sleep well. We gotta exercise. Do all the things that...
Think well, love well.
Do all of these things before you try and get yourself on meds, I would say. That's just a suggestion.
And if you really actually need meds...
But if your doctor's not asking you how your diet and your sleep and your exercises...
Ask your doctor
before they put you on heavy psychotropic medications, maybe consider another opinion. Maybe consider another doctor.
Because, it'd be like... hey, I'm having trouble concentrate. Would you like some meth? What? I mean, Adderall. Would you like some Adderall? Just like, what?
Yeah.
I know they're not exactly the same, but you get my point.
And just learn simple breathing again. Like, we forget how to breathe into our stomach and let our shoulders drop and bring the blood back to the core, like we talked about last episode.
So I heard a phrase, speaking of the breath thing, it was on Critical Role's third campaign. They had this episode that I was watching the other night, and one of the characters in there is just like, remember to breathe, because anxiety is excitement without the breath. I was like, that is good.
That's
Anxiety
nice.
is excitement
Excitement
without the breath.
Yeah,
Yeah.
dude, wow.
I know. I was like, man, I wasn't expecting
That's
wisdom.
exactly
I was just expecting
why
some Dungeons and Dragons.
Why a good
What's going
deep
on?
breath feels so good
Yeah,
when you're
man.
feeling intense trepidation or anxiety or nervous energy.
What do you do right before you do the fall on a roller coaster? You go,
Right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
psychosomatic response.
The body
to anxiety.
needs that oxygen.
Yeah.
You know, a cold shower. When you take a cold shower, and you don't have to start it cold if you're not ready for that. You can start hot, and then just the last 2 minutes of your shower do cold. And notice how your body automatically goes when that cold water hits. And you'll get to where that doesn't happen anymore. You'll have much more control over your body's reaction, and you'll look forward to the coldness when it hits you. But our deep breathing is helping us fit to our environment. And it's the ultimate way to optimize yourself immediately for any situation. You're feeling nerves, 15 deep breaths. You know, if you're feeling sick, do some Wim Hof breathing. We've got episodes on that. Look them up. Just scroll through the previous episodes. There's a few different Wim Hof breathing tutorials out there to bring the inflammation down in your body, to fight off colds, give you more energy, clear the brain, and just generally energize you and super power your immune system.
But don't do them while driving.
Never do that while driving.
Don't do Wim Hof while driving.
Don't. Please don't. Just don't.
Actually, Wim Hof is definitely like
Don't do it while swimming either.
No, yeah, you'll hyperventilate.
Yeah, don't do it
you
in
could
the
pass
water.
out and drown.
It's possible to pass out. Be sitting or laying down in a comfortable, safe place when you do the Wim Hof breathing. But it feels amazing because you're literally basically triggering a release of endogenous chemicals, hormones, that are very beneficial to your body. Compounds such as dimethyltryptamine, which does actually happen to
Oh, this episode's canceled. See y'all later. Sorry.
occur within our own bodies. Hey, we might have lost whatever advertisement, but that's fine.
Yeah, that's okay.
We're small time. We can get away with it. And actually, the big time guys talk about it openly too. So what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And
But
it's produced within our own bodies. So,
Yeah,
hey,
right.
within our lungs and perhaps our liver and brains as well. But that little microdose is so super beneficial. It's something that will raise and increase your awareness, and it will help you fight off illnesses, even ongoing immunocompromised issues such as anti-inflammatory issues within the body. So check it out. Tell your family and your friends, anyone that you know that is struggling with something, try out Wim Hof breathing.
All right, let's get back into
All right,
this.
let's do this.
I'm at 1644.
Copy that. And bring us back a little bit.
Now, I need another scale invariant thing, but I need it to deal with not how neurons are firing, but how they're wiring, what kinds of networks they're forming. I'm not particularly happy with the wiring metaphor, but it has become pervasive in our culture, and it's mnemonically useful because firing and wiring rhyme together. So, again, there is a sort of a new way of thinking about how we can look at network. It's called graph theory or network theory. It's gotten very complex in a very short amount of time. So I want to do just sort of the core basic idea with you, that there's three kinds of networks, right? So this is a neutral, all right? This doesn't mean just networks in the brain. It can mean networks like how the internet is a network. It could mean how an airline is a network, a railway system, etc. This analysis, this theoretical machinery is applicable to all kinds of networks, which is part of its power. So you want to talk about nodes. These are things that are connected, and then you have connections. So I'm drawing two connections here. This isn't a single thick one. These are two individual ones, okay? Two individual connections here. So got sort of the same number, right, of connections and nodes for each network. So there's three kinds of networks. This is called a regular network. It's regular because all of the connections are short distance connections. Okay? And you'll notice that there's a lot of redundancy in this network. Everything is double connected. Okay? This is called a random or a chaotic network. Right? It's a mixture of short and long connections. And then this is called a small world network. This comes from the Disney song, It's a Small World After All, because this was originally sort of discovered by Milgram when he was studying patterns of social connectedness. And it's a small world after all. All right. Now, again, these now, originally people were just talking about these. It's now understood that these are names for broad families of different kinds of networks that can be analyzed into many different subspecies. And I won't get into that detail because I'm just trying to make an overarching core argument. So, remember I said that this network has a lot of redundancy in it? And that's really important because that means that this network is terrifically resilient. I can do a lot of damage to this network and no node gets isolated, nothing falls out of communication. It's tremendously resilient, very resilient. But you pay a price for that, all that redundancy. This is actually a very inefficient network. Now, your brain might trick you because that looks so well ordered. It looks like a nice clean room, right? And clean rooms look like they're really highly ordered, and that's, oh, this must be the most efficient because cleanliness is orderliness and orderliness is efficiency, and you can't let that mislead you. You actually measure how efficient a network is by calculating what's called its mean path distance. I calculate the number of steps between all the pairs. So how many steps do I have to go through to get from here to here? 1, 2. How many do I have to go from here to here? 1, 2, 3, 4. I do that for all the pairs, and then I get an average of it. And the mean path distance measures how efficient your network is at basically communicating information. These have a very, very high mean path distance. So they're very inefficient. You pay a price for all that redundancy. And that's, of course, because redundancy and efficiency are in a trade-off relationship. Now this, and here's where, again, your brain's going to this is so messy, right? This is so messy. Well, it turns out this is actually efficient, right? It's actually very efficient because it has so many long-distance connections. It's very, very efficient. It has a very low mean path distance. But because they're in a trade-off relationship, it's not resilient. Very poor in resiliency, right? So, notice what we're getting here. These networks are being constrained in their functionality by the trade-off in the bioeconomics of efficiency and resiliency. Marcus Breed has sort of mathematical proofs about this in his work on network configuration. Now, what about this one, the small world network? Well, it's more efficient than the regular network, but less efficient than the random network. But it's more resilient than the random network, but less resilient than the regular network. But you know what it is? It's optimal. It gets the optimal amount of both. It optimizes for efficiency and resiliency. It optimizes for efficiency and resiliency. Now that's interesting because that would mean that if your brain is doing relevance realization by trading between efficiency and resiliency, it's going to tend to generate small world networks. And not only that, the small world networks are going to be associated with the highest functionality in your brain. And there's increasing evidence that this is in fact the case. Right? In fact, there was research done by Langer et al. In 2012 that did the same thing, similar thing to what Thatcher did. So here we got this again, RR is G, and it looks like RRs might be implementing, this is what I'm putting here, small world networks. That's these guys, small world networks. And what Thatcher et al. Found is a relationship between these. The more your brain is wired like this, the better your intelligence. Again, is this conclusive? No. Still controversial. That's precisely why it's cutting edge. However, increasingly we're finding that these kinds of patterns of organization make sense. Remember, Marcus Breed was doing work from just looking at just artificial networks, neural networks, and you want to optimize between these. So you're getting design arguments out of artificial intelligence. You're starting to get these arguments emerging out of neuroscience. Interestingly, Langer et al. Did a second experiment in 2013 when you sort of put extra effort, task demands on working memory. You see that working memory becomes even more organized like a small world network. Hilger et al. In 2016 found that there was a specific kind of small world network having to do with efficient hubs. Their thing is entitled Efficient Hubs in the Intelligent Brain. Nodal efficiency of hub regions in the salience network are correlated with general intelligence. So what seems to be going on is, again, suggestive, not conclusive, but you've got the Langer work, working memory goes more like this, and then you've got this very sophisticated kind, a species of this, in recent research, correlated with the salience network in the brain. Do you see that? That as your brain is moving to a specific species of this, within the salience network, you become more intelligent. And the salience network is precisely that network, right, by which things are salient to you, stand out for you, grab your attention. One more time. Is this conclusive? No. I'm presenting to you stuff that's literally happening in the last 2 or 3 years. And as there should be, there's tremendous controversy in science. However, this is what I'm pretty confident of, that controversy is progressive, it's ongoing, it's getting better and better, such that it is plausible that we will be able to increasingly explain, and it'll be increasingly convergent with the ongoing progress in artificial intelligence, that we will be able to increasingly explain relevance realization in terms of the firing and the wiring. Remember, the firing is self-organizing criticality, and the wiring is small world networks. And here's something else that's really suggestive. The more a system fires this way, the more it wires this way. So if a system is firing in a self-organizing critical fashion, it will tend to network as a small world network. The more it wires this way, the more it is wired like a small world network, the more likely it will tend to fire in this pattern. These two things mutually reinforce each other's development. So remember, let's try to put this all together. I want you to really, it's hard to grok this, I get this, but remember, this is happening at a scale invariant, massively recursive, complex, self-organizing fashion. Right? This is also happening scale invariant at a very complex self-organizing recursive fashion, and the two are deeply interpenetrating and affording and affecting each other in ways that have to do directly with engineering the evolving fittedness of your salience, right? Of your salience realization and your relevance realization within your sensory motor interaction with the world. This is, I think, strongly suggestive that we are getting, that this is going to be given a completely naturalistic explanation. Okay. Notice what I'm doing here, right? I'm giving a theoretical structural functional organization for how this can operate. So we got, last time, right, the last couple times we had this strong convergence argument to this. We have a naturalistic account of this, at least the rational promise that this is going to be forthcoming. And then we're getting an idea of how we can get a structural functional organization of this in terms of firing and wiring machinery. Now this is, again, like I said, this is both very exciting and potentially scary because it does carry with it the real potential to give a natural explanation of the fundamental guts of our intelligence. I want to go a little bit further and suggest that not only may this help to give us a naturalistic account of general intelligence, it may point towards a naturalistic account, at least of the functionality, but perhaps also of some of the phenomenology of consciousness. This again is even more controversial. All right? But again, my endeavor here is not to convince you that this is the final account or theory. It's to make plausible the possibility of a naturalistic explanation. Okay, so let's remember a couple things. There's a deep relationship between consciousness, remember the global workspace theory, the functionality, and that overlaps a lot with working memory. This is global workspace theory. Sorry, that should be a T, global workspace theory, working memory. And we already know that there are important overlaps in the brain areas that have to do with general intelligence, working memory, attention, salience, and also that measures of this and measures of the functionality of this are highly correlated with each other. That's now pretty well established. We've also got that we know from Lynn Hash's work that this is doing relevance realization. Do you remember? Also gave you the argument when we talked about the functionality of consciousness that many of the best accounts of the function of consciousness is that it's doing relevance realization. And so this should all hang together. This should all hang together such that the machinery of intelligence and the functionality of consciousness should be deeply integrated together in terms of relevance realization. We do know that there seems to be some important relationships between consciousness and self-organizing criticality. This has to do with the work of Cosmelli et al. And others ongoing. Their work was in 2004. So they did what's called a binocular rivalry experiment. Basically, you present two images to somebody, and they're positioned in such a way that they are going to the different visual fields, and they compete with each other because of their design. And then, so what happens in people's visual experience is let's say it's a triangle and a cross. What they'll have experientially is, I'm seeing a cross. Oh, now I'm seeing a triangle. I'm seeing a cross. Now I'm seeing a triangle. And don't forget, that's not obscure to you, right? So, the Necker cube, right? When you watch the Necker cube, it flips, right? So this can be the front and it's going back this way, right? Or you can flip and you can see it the other way. And so you are even doing binocular, where this is the front and it goes that way, right? So you are constantly flipping between these, and you can't see them both at the same time. So that's what binocular rivalry is. And so what you have, though, is you do this a little bit more controlled. You present it to different visual fields, so different areas of the brain. And so what you can see is what happens when the person is seeing the triangle. Well, one part of the brain goes into synchrony. And then as soon as the triangle, that goes asynchronous, and the other part of the brain that's picking up on the pluses, right, because that's a different area of the brain, it's more basic, right, that goes into synchrony. And what you can see is as the person flips back and forth in experience, different areas of the brain are going into synchrony or asynchrony. So that is suggestive of a relationship between consciousness and self-organizing criticality. Again, suggestive. But we've already got independent evidence, a lot of convergent evidence, that the functionality of consciousness is to do relevance realization, which explains its strong correlation via working memory with measures of general intelligence. And we know that this is plausibly associated with self-organizing criticality. So again, convincing? No. Suggestively convergent? Yes. So there's another set of experiments done by Monti et al. In 2013. And what you're basically doing is you're giving people a general anesthetic, and then you're observing their brain as they pass out of consciousness and back into consciousness. And what did they find? They found that as the brain passes out of consciousness, it loses its overall structure as a small world network and breaks down into more local networks. And then as it returns into consciousness, it goes into a small world network formation again. So that consciousness seems to be strongly associated with the degree to which the brain is wiring as a small world network. Now I want to try and bring these together in a more concrete instance where you can see the intelligence, the consciousness, and this dynamic process of self-organization all at work. I want to bring it back to the machinery of insight. The machinery of insight. So if you remember, we talked about this because we talked about the use of disruptive strategies, and we talked about the work of Stephan and Dixon. Do you remember that what they found was they found a way, a very sophisticated way, but nevertheless a very reliable way of measuring how much entropy is in people's processing when they're trying to solve the insight problem. Remember, they were tracing through the gear figures? And what they found is that entropy goes up right before the insight, and then it drops, and the brain becomes even, the behavior, that was a mistake on my part, the behavior becomes even more organized, right? Now, that's plausibly, and they suggested, that's plausibly an instance of self-organizing criticality. That what's happening is you're getting, the neural avalanche, it's breaking up, and then that allows a restructuring, which goes with the restructuring of the problem. Remember, so you're breaking frame with the neural avalanche, and then you're making frame like the new mound, as you restructure, your problem framing, and you get the insight, and you get a solution to your problem. Now, interestingly enough, Schilling has a so this is linking insight to SOC very clearly. Schilling has a mathematical model from 2005 linking insight to small world networks. She argues quite persuasively, this is very interesting. What you can see happening in an insight is that people's information is initially organized like in a regular network. Just think about that intuitively. So my information is sort of integrated here, Local organization, a regular network, local organization, So the whole thing is, all I've got is a regular network. But what can happen, is here's my regular network. Here, I'll make that a little more clear. Here's my regular network, And what happens is, one of these, I get a long distance connection that forms. So my regular network suddenly is altered into a small world network, which means, I lose some resiliency, but I gain a massive spike in efficiency. I suddenly get more powerful. So insight is when a regular network is being converted into a small world network, because that means this is a process of optimization, right? Because remember, this is more optimal than this. And you can see that in how people's information is organized in an insight. They take two domains. Here's, right? Think about how metaphor affords insight. You take two domains, like Sam is a pig, and you get suddenly this connection between it, and those two regular networks are now coalesced into a small world network. Okay, that's great. So in some of the work I've done with other people, I've been suggesting, because of this, the following: that what happens in insight, a la Stephen and Dixon, is you get self-organizing criticality, and that self-organizing criticality, right, breaks up a regular network and converts it into a small world network. So what you're getting is a sudden enhancement, increased optimization of your relevance realization. And what's it accompanied with? It's accompanied with a flash in salience. Remember? And then that can be extended in the flow experience. You're getting an alteration of consciousness, an alteration of your intelligence, right? An optimization of your fittedness to the problem space. Okay, again, I'm going to say this again, right? I'm trying to give you stuff that makes this plausible. I'm sure that in specifics, it's going to turn out to be false, because that's how science works. But that's not what I need right now. What I've tried to show you is how progressive the project is of naturalizing this, and how so much is converging towards it, that it is plausible that this will be something that we can scientifically explain, and more than scientifically explain, that we'll be able to create as we create autonomous artificial general intelligence. Okay. Let's return back. If I've at least made it plausible that there's a deep connection between relevance realization and consciousness, I want to try and point out some aspects to you about relevance realization and why it is creating a tremendously textured, dynamically flowing salience landscape. Okay, so remember how relevance realization is happening at multiple interacting levels. So we can think about this, right, where, right, you're just getting features that are getting picked up. Remember the multiple object tracking. There's no, this. So basic salience assignment, right? And then this is based on work originally from Mateson in 1976, his book on sentience. I've mentioned that before, and then some work that I did with Jeff Marshman and Steve Pierce, and then later work that I did with Anderson Todd and Richard Wu. The featureization is also feeding up into foregrounding.
All right, guys, we're back. We're going to break now before he gets too much further, because we've covered quite a bit. Yeah, we will. That's all right. All right. So the hope here, where we left off, is to link the emergent scientific understanding with the spiritual quest of solving the meaning crisis. Vervaeke then introduces us to 3 different kinds of networks we can model the brain with. The brain's firing and wiring, you could say, because we're looking for objective ways to measure, not just to prove and and understand how the brain becomes conscious, but also to be able to create that in a wise way as we further develop AGI.
So the 3 theories are the 3 networking types. Mm-hmm. Because you have a circular network, which is, you could imagine like a circle of dots, and they're just connected around the outside. So your starting point, from one point, then your left dot is connected to the dot you're at, and then the next one is connected to that one, and now all the way back around until it's connected back around.
Yeah, just picture like a hexagon.
Yeah.
And it's got each node of that hexagon, you could say, of like the 6 dots. It's got 2 lines,
Yeah, so
going between the next node.
Which is...
And that's a regular
Yeah,
network.
and that's a very resilient network, as in,
Very
like, you know, if you
resilient,
lose a connection, you can still go back.
You got lots of room for redundancy.
Yeah, but not very efficient. So it
It's
has,
not very exacting, no.
what is it, high mean path difference?
It looks clean and simple, but it's
Yeah.
and organized, but it's not great at particularization.
Yes.
Then you have the random, which is super efficient. You know,
But
two
not
things that need to
resilient.
connect are directly connected, but it's not particularly resilient.
Yeah. So I would say that has a low mean path difference.
And then you have the small world network, which is an optimal
Which
amount
is
of
a
both.
combination between the two, which is, yes, you have your connections, say, around the outside of your normal circular network, but then you have, you know, you're crossing across the center that was previously open. So this is all about the small world network because it's the most optimal.
Yep. So it's optimizing for efficiency and resiliency at once.
Yeah, and it's naturally what the brain is tending towards.
Yeah, and each network is, you know, naturally constrained in its functionality by its own traits.
And
we noticed the brain would tend to create small world networks, and there's increasing evidence of this.
The trade-offs are what's constraining it. Is like at any given point in time, you need to be more resilient or more efficient to be optimal. And so the main constraints in this is the trade-offs between the efficiency and the resiliency.
Yes.
Let's see. So the firing and networking ends of things. So the firing would be your oh man.
In terms of trying to find objective ways of measuring this, we're looking at the firing and wiring to explain relevance realization.
Yeah.
And so we're noticing that it's happening scale and variance, so it's happening on all scales, on all levels. We notice that structural functional organization, these theoretical structural functional organization of relevance realization, as Vervaeke is breaking it down in terms of its firing and wiring, it gives us an insight to not just the functionality of a consciousness, but the phenomenology of human consciousness. This is helping us understand things more so than anything before. So many of the best accounts of relevance realization show it being fundamental to consciousness. We notice the relationship between consciousness and self-organizing criticality as well.
Yeah.
So that capacity to break down and then reorganize in an increasingly fit way. It's like the binocular rivalry. The brain goes into synchrony, and then it switches into asynchrony, and then it finds a new synchrony, a new synchronization, or synchrony, however you want to put that.
So yeah, he brought up Langer and Hobar, I think, or Hodor. I don't know.
I missed the second.
So Langer's observation was that general intelligence, relevance realization, and small world networks were tied together, and this would be in the end the world of like digital networks. Whereas Hobar, forgive me if I'm getting the name wrong, came up with this idea of efficient hub networks of salience networking. And so the combination between these two, salience and small world networking, basically keeps progressing us. So it's they were, I won't say they were both right or they're both wrong, but there is a movement between the salience and the actual networking of the components.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So the firing and the wiring, we're starting to get to see bits and pieces of. We noticed this in a study where they're putting people under general anesthetic, and as the brain passes out of consciousness, it's losing its small world networks. They're just kind of falling apart and becoming disparate, fading into the background, and then some kind of independent little nodes that aren't really well connected or just kind of come up instead. And then as you regain consciousness, you come back into that rich world of interconnected small world networks.
Yeah, so right before that, when you were talking about the binocular rivalry, so you put a cube up there, and you can look at this cube, and you can see it as one way being forward and one way being backwards, or the triangle and the cross. Your brain will see one or the other, and what's happening right there is that you're seeing one portion of the brain go into
A small world network, basically.
What's the word?
Synchrony.
Synchrony, and then one going into asynchrony.
Yes.
And then when you shift, say, from, what you think is the forward square, now it goes to the back square, and you'll see another portion of the brain synchronized,
That's
and
right.
then another portion of the brain asynchronized, and it's happening in many, but and depending on like where you're moving, because like the field of view, your brain picks up things different in your field of view. Interesting little fact: did you know that humans are adapted to be able to see snake camouflage best in the lower portion of their field?
Yes.
Interestingly enough, so it's so you move these things around, and your brain starts to light up, and
I've seen a talk Jay Peterson did on that, in that snakes and fruit probably aided human beings in developing color vision and highly accurate definition vision, so you can pick up fine details and separate camouflage from.
And we can actually see movement better out of our peripheries than we can out of our direct centralized field of looking.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's blurry out here, but you can really pick up on
and that's actually like, so if you're ever walking through a city and everything, the best way to walk through a city is with your eyes slightly down, not down at your feet, but slightly down, because it opens up your peripheral view. So if you're walking by, say, like an alley or something like that, and you see something move towards you, you can respond better. I don't know if anybody else got that talk when they were younger, but that's how you move through a dangerous city.
That's really helpful.
But yeah, so
that's good stuff. So okay, so we're noticing when the brain recognizes one face of that square that he drew, then it's in this one kind of, so it's in a synchrony. The small world networks are lit up and they're seeing the thing, but then they kind of erase themselves when you're trying to see it the other way, and they immediately reform when you see it from the other angle.
Yeah, and so Monty et al. In 2013 observed under general anesthetic. What you're talking about is like, as you're going out of consciousness, it breaks down from small world organization into local networks. But then when you're coming out of it, it restructures into small world networks.
Yes. So the same thing we noticed happening under the general anesthesia is happening all the time in our brains. Yeah. When it's doing the binocular rivalry even. Okay, so we get down to insight with Stephen and Dixon's studies, and they were looking at how entropy increases right before insight occurs, and then the behavior becomes more organized. So they're noticing here.
Are you sure about that? Because I think I have a note, is as entropy drops, behavior organizes. So a dropping of entropy.
Entropy increases right before, and then it drops.
And then it drops.
Yes, that's what happens.
Because entropy, bad language, but entropy could be thought of like chaos.
Yes.
Entropy dropping is actually an increase of order.
Yes, that's right. So the entropy increases right before the insight. So there's a bunch of new information coming in that's being considered now. And then it drops because it's gotten the new information it needs to understand. It's created a new small world network
and then
out of it. Yeah, and then it collapses into that new SWN small world network.
Yeah, so it's Schelling.
So they're recognizing the self-organizing criticality that is occurring in the human brain there through that study.
And what Schelling.
And then Schilling, or Schelling.
It looks like Schilling on the page, but I think it was Schelling.
Schelling.
So we have the emergence of small world networks from local regular networks. And so you have your local regular network. It's just a ring where every dot's just connected to the one next to it. There's no cross. And then insight is that moment where you get a cross from one to the other that breaches across the center of this ring network. That's the flash of insight. Is the taking one point that is the opposite or somewhere away from it, and then bam, there's the insight.
Yeah.
And I guess Dixon, Stephen and Dixon found that in their own way too. Is like, you building up, and then there's the moment of collapse, but then there's the insight of, there's the building up and then the collapsing down, and the building up and then and the collapsing down, and the collapsing down is the building up, and the building up is also the collapsing down. Oh boy. So
Yeah, and
that, but
the
that,
regular
so the
net
collapse
evolves into a new SW or a small world network.
Yeah, so the collapse of the previous network, or this the what's it called, the SOC,
Oh, self-organizing
self-organizing criticality, breaks up the regular network into small world networks. So
That's right.
it's this criticality that creates the moment that these two things bond, or this new pathway is created.
Yeah,
and we
so
call
this
that
is the
insight.
place where it's like we're introducing noise.
Yeah.
And in the deep learning machines that we've been developing, we notice that if we give them a time to go to sleep and then wake back up, we introduce noise, and then they get at the task again. They do the same thing our brains do. They're like, insight. I've figured it out. So we're seeing a ton of convergence in science that's helping us to perhaps not only explain a plausible theory of relevance realization and how it plays in consciousness, but ways to be able to create consciousness itself in autonomic machines. This is scary stuff, and he admits that openly. And this is why Vervaeke is trying so hard to instill some wisdom into this game that we find ourselves involved in now.
So
texture dynamically flowing, salience tracking.
That's where we should be. That's where we should come back. I've got a timestamp for that.
Okay. Futurization.
4048.
All right, guys, we're going to jump back in here.
Yeah.
Okay, so remember how relevance realization is happening at multiple interacting levels. So we can think about this, right? Where, right, you're just getting features that are getting picked up. Remember the multiple object tracking. There's no, this. So basic salience assignment, right? And then this is based on work originally from Mateson in 1976, his book on sentience. I've mentioned that before, and then some work that I did with Jeff Marshman and Steve Pierce, and then later work that I did with Anderson Todd and Richard Wu. The featurization is also feeding up into foregrounding and feeding back, right? So a bunch of this is all these features, and then presumably I'm foregrounded and other stuff is backgrounded, right? This then feeds up into figuration. You're configuring me together and figuring me out. Think of that language, right? So that I have a structural, functional organization. I'm aspectualized for you. That's feeding back, and of course there's feedback down to here. And then that, of course, feeds back to and up to framing, how you're framing your problems. And we've talked a lot about that, and that feeds back, right? So you've got, right, this happening, and it's giving you this very dynamic and textured salience landscape. And then you have to think about how that's the core machinery of your perspectival knowing, right? Notice what I'm suggesting to you here. You've got the relevance realization that is the core machinery of your participatory knowing. It's how you are getting coupled to the world so that co-evolution, reciprocal realization can occur. That's your participatory knowing. This feeds back to, right, your salience landscaping. Right? This is your perspectival knowing. This is what gives you your dynamic situational awareness. Your dynamic situational awareness. This textured salience landscaping. This, of course, is going to, we'll talk more about that, it's going to open up an affordance landscape for you. Certain connections, right? Affordances are going to become obvious to you, right? And you say, oh man, does anybody, like, this is so abstract. Look, this is how people are trying to wrestle with this now. Here's an article from Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. Self-organizing, free energy minimization, that's Friston's work, and it has to do with ultimately about getting your processing as efficiently as possible, and optimal grip on a field of affordances, using all of this language that I'm using with you right now. That's by Brunenberg and Retveld from 2014, Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. Just as one example among many. Okay, so this is feeding up, and what it's basically giving you is affordance obviation. Certain affordances are being selected and made obvious to you. Okay, and that, of course, is going to be the basis of your procedural knowing how to interact. Okay, and I think there might be a way in which that more directly interacts here, maybe through kinds of implicit learning, but I'm not going to go into that. We'll come back later into how propositional knowing relates to all of this. Okay, I'm putting it aside because this is where we do most of our talking about consciousness, right? With this, I think, at the core, the perspectival knowing. But it's the perspectival knowing that's grounded in our participatory knowing, and it's a perspectival knowing. Look, your situational awareness that obviates affordances is what you need in order to train your skills. That's how you train your skills. And we know that consciousness is about doing this higher order relevance realization, because that's what this is. This is higher order relevance realization that affords you solving your problems. Okay, so this is, I'm trying to say, all of this when I'm talking about your salience landscaping. I'm talking about it as the nexus between your relevance realization, participatory knowing, and your affordance obviation, procedural knowing, your skill development, right? Perspectival knowing at the core. And then what's happening in here is this. If that's the case, then you can think of your salience landscape as having at least sort of 3 dimensions to it. Right? Right. So one is pretty obvious to you, which is the aspectuality. Your salience, as I said, your salience landscape is aspectualizing things. Things, right? Okay, so the features are being foregrounded and configured, and they're being framed. So this is a marker. It is aspectualized. Remember, whenever I'm representing or categorizing it, I'm not capturing all of its properties. I'm just capturing an aspect. So this is aspectualized. Everything is aspectualized for me. Right? There's another dimension here of centrality. I'll come back to this later, but this has to do with the way relevance realization works. Relevance realization is ultimately grounded in how things are relevant to you, right? Literally how they are important to you. You import, right? How they are constitutive, right? At some level, the sensory motor stuff is to get stuff that you literally need to import materially, and then at a higher level, you literally need to import information to be constitutive of your cognition. We'll come back to that transition later. But what you have is, right, the perspectival knowing is there's doing aspectuality, and then everything is centered. It's not, right, it's not non-valenced. It's vectored onto me. And then it has temporality. Because this is a dynamic process of ongoing evolution. Timing, small differences in time make huge impacts, huge differences in such dynamical processing. Kairos is really, really central. When you're intervening in these very massively recursive, dynamically coupled systems, small variations can unexpectedly have major changes. So things have a central relevance in terms of their timing, not just their place in time. So think of your salience landscape as an unfolding, like in these 3 dimensions of aspectuality, centrality, and temporality. There's an acronym here, ACT. This is an enacted kind of perspectival knowing. All right, so you've got consciousness, and what it's doing for me functionally is all of this. But what it's doing in that functionality is all of this. And what that's giving me is perspectival knowing that's grounded in participatory knowing, that affords procedural training, and that it has aspectuality, a salience landscape that has aspectuality, centrality, and temporality. It has, look at what it has. Centrality is the here-ness. My consciousness is here because it is indexed on me. Of course, it has nowness because timing is central to it. No, right? That was intended, that move, right? And it has togetherness, unity, how everything fits together. I don't want to say unity because unity makes it sound like there's a single thing, but how there's a oneness to your consciousness. It's all together. You have the here-ness, the nowness, the togetherness, the salience, the perspectival knowing, how it is centered on you. A lot of the phenomenology of your consciousness is explained along with the functionality of your consciousness. Is that a complete account? No. But it's a lot of what your consciousness does and is. It's a lot of what your consciousness does and is. So, I would argue that at least what that gives us is an account that we're going to need for the right hand of the diagram. Why altering states of consciousness can have such a profound effect on your reaching down to your identity, up into your agency. Why it could be linked to things like a profound sense of insight. We've talked about this before when we talked about higher states of consciousness. How it can feel like a dramatic coupling to your environment. That's that participatory coupling that we found in flow. This all, I think, hangs together extremely well, which means it looks like I have the machinery I need to talk about that right hand of the diagram. Before I do that, I want to make a couple of important points to remind you of things. Relevance realization is not cold calculation. It is always about how your body is making risky, affect-laden choices of what to do with its precious but limited cognitive and metabolic and temporal resources. Relevance realization is deeply, deeply always, and think about how this also connects to this and to consciousness. It's always, always an aspect of caring. That's what Reid Montague argues, the neuroscientist, in his book, Your Brain is Almost Perfect, that what makes us fundamentally different from computers, because we are in the finitary predicament, is we are caring about our information processing and caring about the information processed therein. So this is always affect. It's things are salient. They're catching your attention. They're arousing, they're changing your level of arousal. Remember that how arousal is an ongoing, evolving part of this, right? And they are constantly creating affect, motivation, moving, emotion, moving you towards action. You have to hear how at the guts of consciousness intelligence, there is also caring. And that's very important, right? That's very important. Because that brings back, I think, a central notion, and I know many of you are wondering why I haven't spoke about him yet, but I'm going to speak about him later, right? From Heidegger, that at the core of our being in the world is a foundational kind of caring. And this connection I'm making, this is not far-fetched. Look at somebody deeply influenced by Heidegger who's central to the third generation or 4E cognitive science. That's the work of Dreyfus and others. And Dreyfus has had a lot of important history in reminding us that our knowing is not just propositional knowing, it's also procedural and ultimately, I think, perspectival and participatory. He doesn't quite use that language, but he points towards it. He talks a lot about optimal gripping, and importantly, right, if you take a look at his work, Being in the World, on Heidegger, when he's talking about things like caring, he's invoking in central passages the notion of relevance. Relevance. And when he talked about what computers can't do, and later on what computers still can't do, what they're basically lacking is this Heideggerian machinery of caring, which he explicates in Being in the World in terms of the ability to find things relevant. And this, of course, points again towards Heidegger's notion of Dasein, right? That our being in the world is inherent, to use my language, is inherently transjective, because all of this machinery is inherently transjective. And it is something that we do not make. We and our intelligible world co-emerge from it. We participate in it. And I want to take a look more at what that means for our spirituality next time. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Meow, 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 meow. Ruff, ruff, ruff. Ruff, ruff, ruff. Ruff, 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 ruff.
Meow.
So, yeah, we talked about the things that are of the participatory knowing, the featurization, seeing the features of things, the foregrounding of the things,
yes.
the figuring of the things, the figuring them out, and then the framing of the things, and that's the participatory end of this.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the perspectual end, and the perspectual end is your landscape from your perspective. Your salience landscape from your perspective,
which he recognizes as at the nexus of all of this functionality.
Yes. Yeah. And then your procedural knowing is your affordance landscape, like from what is salient to you, what does it afford you to do?
Yes. And how does that feel when you're doing that? The consciousness of the procedural knowing, like how to drive a car. Yeah. You can intellectually understand until you've done it. You really don't understand the procedural side of it.
And he used the word obviation, which is to make obvious. So this procedural end is what makes things obvious.
Obvious. Super salient. Yeah.
And then there's propositional knowing, which he's setting aside for now, but that was in there as well. But
yeah, so the perspectival is the dynamical situational awareness that opens affordance landscapes to us. Mm-hmm. And then I got so many different versions of this graph that he drew because I kept running out of space.
Yeah, so basically,
the relevance realization is the participatory aspect. That's the feeling of one's own self.
Yeah. So it's like, like you participate in the finding the features of something, which then allows you to put them in a foreground or background relationship, figure out what's going on there, and then frame it properly.
Yep.
And then out of that, you get what is salient, what is most apparent.
Yes.
Kind of like the teacher in the classroom. Okay, you're foreground, you got this area. Okay, the features or somebody standing in front. Okay, well, foreground, obviously this person's in the foreground, so that's the teacher. Figuring out what they're doing. Oh, they're a teacher. And then framing it into, oh, I'm in class.
Yes. So what's salient to us, our perspectival awareness, is grounded in our relevance realization or our participatory awareness. So we get to see the salience landscape broken down into 3 dimensions. This was really intriguing, the way he broke it down into centrality, temporality, and aspectuality. Yeah,
so it'd be your up and down axis would be your centrality, which is what is relevant to you.
Centrality.
It gives the here-ness, the now-ness. And then your left and right would be your aspectuality. So what makes it perspectival, like you're perceiving from your perspective the aspects of, say,
these
this
are the features, the aspects, yeah.
And then the forward backward would be the temporality, the nowness, the timing, the kairos.
Yes.
Or kairos, excuse me. So there's here-ness, and then there's nowness. So the here-ness is the central, the nowness is the temporality.
Yes.
And then there's the togetherness, which is the aspects of the here-ness and the nowness that make this the thing. That's
oneness.
Yeah.
He shied away from unity there.
Yeah, because it's not a unified thing. It's as in like it's all just one thing. It's here-ness, now-ness, and the here and the now together to create a perspective.
Yes, they're transjective. This has reminded me of the Trinity too. This is really intriguing. So relevance realization, how things are important to you. Things that, this is so cool. So what we care about is what our relevance realization is doing for us in our minds. What we care about is what we find relevant. Of course, that makes sense. But the things that are important to me, that are relevant to me, are things I need to import into my body. So it's going to be food, or it's going to be knowledge.
So
or
it's
something
not
like
it's
that.
not a cold calculation, like you said, but it's an active. Well, I put hot set of choices. And aspects of, caring. What do you care about? Ultimately, your body cares about, well, keeping the body alive long enough to procreate, if you want to go that base of it. But there, you could further it, like, well, I want to be comfortable, and I, want to have somebody important in my life, and maybe have kids. So then, well, if I want to be comfortable, I need to get a job so I can afford a house that at least, maybe has an air conditioning or at least something soft to sit on. And if I want, like, a wife and kids, well, I got to make it better than just a place to sit and play my video games. So, I got to. Okay. So what is relevant in each level of that, the growing through and realizing what is relevant, it's this unfolding, what he said, unfolding ACT, which is the aspect, centrality, and temporality. So unfolding act.
That's it, man. It's beautiful. This co-creative unfoldment that we are involved with the universe, everything around us at all times. Things have essential relevance due to their timing, not just their place and time. That was really interesting. So the enacted perspectival knowing allows us consciousness and its functionality to do all of the things that Vervaeke listed over the past 10, 20 minutes there. So we went over the here-ness and the now-ness. Okay, that brings us to altered states of consciousness.
Before we get to that, so to explain this whole thing he's been talking about, like at the center of his whiteboard is relevance realization, firing and wiring, which is SOC, the criticality,
breaking down
the networks,
how the brain is actually objectively doing it.
All that is the functionality.
And then the functionality.
But then on the right side of his board where he had, the perspectival knowing, which is your featurization, foregrounding and all that.
Figurine framing.
Down to salience landscapes and affordance landscapes. That is what it's doing. What is relevance realization doing?
Yes.
And then on the left side, when we got into, ACT, the ACT end of this, aspectuality, centrality, and the temporality, that's what is being made. So there's the function of it, what's the function doing, and what's being made by the function doing what it does.
Yes.
And this was that whole last section that we talked about.
So everything feeding in to what makes relevance realization work is now going to enable us on the other end of relevance realization, where he draws the RR on the whiteboard. You got all these arrows feeding in to describe how is this functioning, how is this working. Now we're going to be able to learn how to bring this into actuality.
Yeah. And that's where the altered states of consciousness come in, is now that we're figuring out how we can like look at the brain and also use all that we've been talking about to make a proper account of what's going on within, say, an altered state of consciousness. And so it's not just, the mystical end of like, I saw space elves and all this stuff. It's like, well, in your brain, we saw this light up and this light up and this weird little doohickey over there we're not sure of, but we're going to stick it to the side for now. And we're going to continue going until eventually he goes, oh, that little doohickey, that allows you to travel through time and space.
Right.
What? I don't know.
It might go that direction. We don't know where this goes.
I have a theory that...
We do know that we're going to get a more exact science of spirituality than we've ever had before.
Yeah. And
we're going to be able to prove why higher states of consciousness are valuable to our species, are important to our bioeconomic agency in the world. So we're going to at least give on one hand, we have at least an account now of how consciousness and relevance realization may be working. And then on the other end, we can now look at altered states of consciousness, which are linked to such deep, profound, meaningful changes in consciousness. Why are they so useful? How can we tool and design our rituals to be even more effective at cultivating wisdom in our lives? Because we're recognizing relevance realization, it's not cold calculation in the brain. It's not just information moving. It's about how the brain body is making risky choices that affect its environment and its limited metabolic and temporal time resources.
And to make that choice, something must care.
Something must care. There's always an aspect of caring there involved in the relevance realization.
And maybe that's where the gap between what an artificial intelligence can do and can't do, because there's still certain things that they can't do. And
do we need to come up with artificial heart to go along with the artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
You know, because we do. Humans have a ton of neurons involved in our cardiovascular system. The heart is full of neurons. And there's even...
I think it produces more of a voltage than your brain actually does.
Right?
Well, which makes sense because it's actually a motor that's doing this. So it's going to naturally produce a lot of energy, but still... And even down into, you have your second brain, which is the plexus in your gut. It's right by your stomach, encased by your intestines.
It's a toroidal machine. It's taken in and then putting out, and taken in and putting out in this one giant channel. We do have a new field called neurocardiology, I believe, for understanding how the neuron heart structure is working. What is involved there? And you mentioned also the gut.
Yeah.
Like we have neurons in our gut, too, of course, throughout our bodies, but we have large nests, you could say, concentrated areas of neuronal networks within our gut, within our hearts, and within our heads and spine.
Oh, there's a word for it, for that. It's like central plexus or whatever that's in your gut. That is the one that's tied to your diaphragm and breathing, and like if you do chi work exercises and stuff, that's the font of energy that comes out. You're like, your first chakra is your grounding chakra, your second is your reproductive, and then this third in yellow is the seed of energy coming out through you, that then moves through your heart and then into your throat, then you can communicate up into your third eye and then out the top. That's head. The opposite of your root. And I don't think it's just
when you finally open up your circuit all the way, it's like you're...
Yeah, and I don't think it's just all like, wishy-washy to be able to sell like, bad yoga art and stuff too. There's something to that as well.
It's ancient for a reason. It's been there. The meridian energy lines through the body have been measured by more than one different culture.
When you feel different emotions in different parts of your body too, like when you feel dread, that's a sinking portion in your gut. Like or sinking sensation in the portion of your body that is the gut.
Yeah, and the heart literally feels warmed and filled by glowing, beautiful moments.
Yeah, or
pains like hurt when you're in a really sad, distressed state.
It flutters when you're like infatuated.
Yeah,
and then when you're thinking and you're like too much like in your head and you're just like, oh boy, you can feel it. And even beyond a headache, but like the fatigue behind the eyes that comes from worrying or thinking, or you get that really light sensation that's kind of like waking up again when you come to a realization. So you literally feel your emotions and realizations in different portions of your body. So if you're feeling a little ungrounded, you might have the squirts or you might be constipated. So it's, and that's also where the soil comes from. The human soil, the night soil, if you will. It comes from the bottom end, so that grounds you to the ground. And then when you stand up tall and you really feel like you're growing and everything, and you really feel connected to everything else, you feel something up here. And particularly like, opium. Opium is said to have an effect where it's like when it takes over, it starts at the top of your head, like a crushed egg, and then just moves down your body into everything else. And opium was one of these medicines that were taken for a very long time, not just to like, milk of the poppy so they can cut off your leg, but like something to get you in the, into a state.
That's right. Yeah. Well, they used to use them.
Cannabis,
we used to
opium,
infuse.
psilocybin,
We used to infuse our wines and beers with different entheogens or psychedelic, you could say, plants, and they would often introduce opium into those mixtures to help take the edge off of the particularly powerful.
It's kind of like kava. If you're going to go into a very stressful, altered state of consciousness, kava can help do that without kava is, as far as I know, non-addictive like opium is. So it's like, if you're...
We get ourselves into trouble when we super synthesize these things.
Yeah, well, kava
concentrates, and then we start snorting and doing.
But luckily, kava is like a root or a bark or something like that. So you can make a tea out of it.
Kava tea is good stuff.
And
a little bit minor mouth numbing when you take a high dose, but it definitely.
But I mean, like if you got a toothache that's giving you issues,
like a nice small amount of euphoria, it's not bad.
Yeah, it's. I would say
there are safer things out there.
Yeah,
I think.
But also talk to your doctor and get if you're going to do an herbalist, get a legit professional.
Oh, and we were talking about Wim Hof breathing earlier. That is literally your cheapest, most immediately effective way to change your body's chemistry and release a ton of feel-good endorphins. And the Wim Hof breathing technique. Look it up on the previous episodes here on Actuali.
There's another technique too to deal with when you're unable to concentrate, you're extremely stressed, anxiety ridden, and you can't even think 1 second at a time, and it's soft belly breathing. And that's where you breathe in with your belly and you keep your chest still and you breathe like a baby and you think 1, and then you breathe out and you think 2, and if you lose track you start back at 1 till eventually you can get that 1 second of pure just not in your head, not anxious, not anxiety, and it's the calming breath.
I had a psychology teacher that had a really interesting counting technique that he did, and he taught or did one guided meditation session with us, and it's 1 over and over again for every breath, and that's an interesting technique. You can also just feel your presence, feel this moment, feel the feeling of being here.
I think that's the
prior to any descriptions or mental talk about it, just the feeling of I am. Like amness, you could say, or beingness.
Yeah, so
just to feel that feeling, and then you notice when thoughts come up, and then that was a thought. Okay, we're turning back to being.
So that I am, I came up with a counter with that because I, personally, I have a problem with where that can lead you if you go. It's like I am, and it does the ego thing. It's the I am I, and that's
good.
The relate that what do you call it? The counter relationship there's the statement of I am, and then there's the question of am I.
There's also a posture when you're meditating and with a sense of wonder, like curiousness and wonder of it. So when you're thinking I am, you're considering what is I? What does I even mean?
Until eventually,
what does am even mean?
Until it turns eventually into am being.
Right.
Just the being of am.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make sense because if you say a word too many times, and I think I said am too many times, and now my brain's just like...
Every once in a while, in the guided meditations, I'll say it, just be as this moment. Yeah. And that one's been helpful for me before. I forget who I heard say that the first time, but that's not just be the moment or be in this moment, because we really are synonymous with everything around us, more so than we can regularly realize most of the time. That sense of oneness Vervaeke spoke about is a real palpable thing that humans can experience. So allowing oneself to spend time in presence opens you up to that intrinsic interconnectedness that is running through all things around us. And then you start to notice this little things more.
A little seat gets you closer to the seat of wisdom that is within all things, if you will.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, you gotta almost.
It's a long road to manifest wisdom through meditation. It's a little bit faster when you find someone that's very wise that you're learning from.
Well, meditation is just one half.
Meditation's heck of a lot better than nothing.
One half of the equation.
Yeah.
There's then the contemplation.
Well, that's just
and
the
relationship between
and the
the
relation
two
aspect.
help
And that's
build.
what Vervaeke, I think, does such a good job of illustrating for us here, is that there's multiple modes of mindfulness. It's not just inward. It's not just outward.
It's not just the components.
Because you've got spiritual systems that are super dedicated to the inward, then ones that are super dedicated to the outward. Yeah. Some schools of Buddhism dedicate both to the inward and the outward, but
that's
they're
where
not
you
as popular.
And that's where
a
you
lot
got
of Buddhism
things
is secular. A lot of it's super spiritual and divine and this and that. So
and you got things like your physical practices like Tai Chi.
Yeah.
And even the Kung Fu Buddhism, the Buddhist monks that are Kung Fu masters.
And that's the action
and stuff.
side of it. Yeah. And
they'll
then there's
do
the
both.
communal. And there's the communal.
Much time of meditating, and then throwing in the physical, and then
Active
contemplating, and then throwing in the physical actions, which is both of them.
Both of them together.
Yeah.
That's it. That's what.
And that's
that
why
is.
you have different forms that you use, or like.
And then if you do that with a group of people, you're doing it in a communal situation.
Yeah.
So it's now
that's your sapiential.
Bringing in the philosophical aspect
your
of it.
Sapiential community that helps. With this Gnostic state, you have an altered state of consciousness that's on top of a ritual that's on top of the sapiential.
Yeah, they help you check yourself, correct yourself.
Yeah.
They help you through problems,
And the ritual would be the practice itself, and the altered state as well.
Yeah. And then it's another
doing that
aspect
kind
of
of
the
stuff changes the way your brain works. Like
it does.
Waking up every morning at a certain time, in a certain environment and going through certain practices changes. You don't need chemicals necessarily to do it because, well, you're pre-built with all the chemicals you need to have pretty much any state you need.
Literally chemical labs, walking, talking chemical labs.
Little synthesizers of taking other stuff and turning it into things we need.
Yeah.
We don't eat serotonin, but somehow we always have it there at demand.
Oh yeah, you can always get a nice little boost of serotonin when you need it, if you know how to trigger it.
Yeah. Well, it's about that time.
Yeah, I think so, fam.
Yeah.
This has been an awesome episode.
Yeah, it was a good one.
Yeah, I love the way you brought everything together at the end there. And look forward to next episode, because now we are going to see how to apply these things in our spiritual lives, in our actual relation with this world and within ourselves.
Yeah.
So we're gonna start moving into some very exciting territory now. It's not just gonna be very nitty gritty, very detail oriented, very complex proof of relevance, realization, and how it works in the brain and why this is relevant to us. Now we're gonna get into the actual application of what we've learned. So stay tuned, guys. This is gonna be good.
Yeah.
Well, we love you guys. I've been Chris.
I've been DJ.
We'll see you guys next Wednesday, 8 p.m. EST. Facebook, Twitch, or YouTube, wherever you like, or in podcast land, whenever you like to listen. We're all over Spotify, Apple, and Stitcher, and Pocket Cast, and all the rest of those. So go ahead and give us a good rating on Spotify and Apple if you guys feel interested in helping us.
And always share with your friends.
Share with the fam and friends, and make sure that you're giving Mr. Vervaeke a like and a subscribe as well if you find any of this information intriguing. There's a lot more.
Yep.
And that's it. All right, guys. We're going to see you next time.
Wow.